All right. Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Marcus Holmes. I am the sales engineer here at Zyxel. Just a quick introduction about myself. I've been with the company for about 15 years, and some of you may have worked with me in the past on your projects or on-demand training sessions to go over like the setup of your equipment via screen share. I work primarily with our regional sales agents, Jacob, Olson, and David Chin. So basically, whenever there's a sales opportunity, they'll get me involved. And specifically when it comes to like AP placement based on floor plans and equipment suggestions based on the scope of the project itself, I'll get involved with that. So today we're going to be talking about the best practices for setting up your security appliances. And the reason for this webinar is because we've gotten requests about this specific topic in the past. And we're going to go over how to set up the basic setups for your ATP and your USG and getting it installed. So we're going to focus primarily on those best practices, and I'll touch briefly on the security services. However, I do plan to do a more full in-depth overview of the security services and how to get those set up in another webinar at another later date. So let's go over the agenda for today. We'll be talking primarily about the signature updates, how to get those installed, and how to get them updated on the firewall. We'll talk about the firmware updates and the firmware update mechanism and how to schedule it. We'll go over the user accounts, how to set up your users, how to give them specific privileges, and then also how to set up the best practices for the security of those particular users. We'll talk about remote management and what's the best way to set up remote management for your devices. We'll touch on the WAN and LAN aspects of your firewall and the best way to set up those particular devices as well for WAN and LAN access. And then finally, we're going to touch on the configuration backup, how to do the configuration backup, and basically how to understand how the configuration backup works. So we'll start with a live GUI demo. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my GUI for the firewall. So you should see our firewall GUI here. So when you install a firewall and get it set up, you'll be presented with a wizard if it's your first time. And after going through the wizard, you'll land on this page. And this is your dashboard. This is your main dashboard that gives you an overview of the device itself. So we're going to focus right now on the first agenda topic, which is going to be our signature updates. So we have 5 icons on the left-hand side. We have our dashboard, we have our quick setup, which is basically our wizard. We have our monitor, we have our configuration, and we have our maintenance tab. So today we're going to be focusing on these 2 tabs here, which is our configuration and our maintenance tab. So clicking on the configuration, we can come to licensing and come to signature update. Now, when these devices ship from the factory, they're going to be installed with a base signature version. So if you're using our USGs, our Flex USGs, or our ATP, you're going to need to update these signatures. Now, if you're using a device like our VPN series, you won't need to do this because it doesn't rely on signatures as much as our ATP and our USGs do. So if you're using the license features of our firewalls, you will need to update these as soon as you get the device online. So if you look at this, you can see that this comes pre-installed with signatures that are well out of date. If you come over to the right-hand side, there's an option here. Clicking on these different options here will allow the device to automatically do a signature update. So clicking on this will update the anti-malware, app patrol, IDP, URL threat filter, and IP reputation. If you're using our ATP, you will have a little bit more different options as it does have sandboxing, of course. So on the right-hand side, we're going to be looking at our scheduler. So by default, some of these options will be set to weekly, but we suggest that you set it to daily. The time doesn't matter, but you can set it to be any time during the day, as when it performs this signature update, it does not have any effect on the performance of the device itself. It won't interrupt any of the users who are currently working, so you can choose any time of the day to do your auto update. Setting it to the specific time, it'll check to see if there's a current update available. And if there is an update available, it'll automatically download it to the firewall itself. So again, by default, definitely go through each one of these, make sure it's set to daily, as by default, some of these are set to weekly. You can choose it to update at the same time of date, or you can schedule them out a little bit, an hour each for each one of these signatures. Once you have all of this set up, then all of your signatures will be ready to go and they'll automatically update if there's a new update available. Next, we want to talk about our firmware updates. To go to firmware, we need to go over to the maintenance section. Under maintenance, we would come over here to firmware management. Now, all of our USGs and our ATPs have a running and a standby. And in fact, there's a question that actually just came in right now. The question asks, does it matter if all the signature updates kick off at the same time or should they be staggered? No, actually, they can be kicked off at the same time. You could choose to stagger them if you want, because there are instances where some signatures may not update until later on, or they may not show up in the cloud server until later on in the afternoon or later on in the morning. You can stagger them, but it's not going to have any effect on it. You could choose to have them run at the same time. And so going back to the firmware management, we have two firmware banks. So all of our devices have two specific firmware banks, and this is because there's a running firmware, which is the firmware that's currently running, and then there's a standby firmware. The standby firmware is there so that whenever a firmware update is performed, it can be downloaded directly to the device without having to run the firmware and interrupt the actual services. So in our firmware management tab, we can do a check. Now, currently this device is currently offline, but if you click the check now option, it will show what the latest version is of the firmware. It'll give the release date, and there will be a section for the release notes for you to check out. Down here at the bottom, there's an auto update option. So if you do the auto update, you have it set up to do a schedule similar to our signature updates. So you can choose a date, or basically daily or weekly, and you can choose a time for it to check. So we suggest that you time it to be sometime after hours where there's no business being conducted, something like maybe 11 o'clock at night, or maybe we go to 1 o'clock in the morning. Now, it'll automatically check and pull down the latest firmware update if there's one available. It will not apply it unless you choose this auto reboot option. If you have the auto reboot option checked, it'll automatically download the firmware directly to the standby partition, and then it'll automatically apply it. If you choose not to do this option, what you can do is have it automatically download to the standby partition, and then you can schedule it on your own time to do the firmware update. Simply come in here, check your standby, make sure that it has the correct firmware version right here. This one shows the base one, but if this were an update, it would show the latest firmware version in the version tab here. And then you highlight it and click the reboot option. And this will automatically apply the firmware update. So you have a little bit of flexibility here when it comes to setting up your firmware updates. You can choose to do it automatically, or you can have it automatically download, and then you can schedule to apply the firmware at your leisure. Now, the question came in, should we do daily or weekly firmware checks? Honestly, I would do daily. Personally, it's much better to have it checked daily because if you set it to weekly, and let's just say that a new firmware update comes out that fixes major bugs, you'll have to wait for the next weekly cycle in order for it to check again. And you want it to come in as quickly as possible. Now, there is a mechanism that when you log into the GUI, it will tell you if there's a new firmware available as well. So you do have that mechanism that's available directly when you log in. But definitely, I would set this to do daily and do it after hours if possible. Next, we're going to talk about our user accounts on the device. So if we come over here to configure or configuration, we come down to object, we come to user group, we have our built-in users. So the device has a built-in admin user. We have LDAP users, Radius users, AD users, and user agreement users. Your admin user is the default admin for the device itself. If you want to, you can create multiple admins by coming to the add, and you can create a new admin. In the drop-down list, we have admin, limited admin, user, guest, external user, and external user group. External and external user group, these are specifically used for AD integration. A guest account is used for web authentication along with the user account as well. And these are used for setting up a web authentication page so that if you want to set it up in, say, a Starbucks, you can, where it has a splash page, and the users have to enter in a user name and password to gain access to the internet. For the admin, we have admin and limited admin. Admin has full read and write access, whereas limited admin has only read access. So you have the ability to set up multiple admins that you can give to your users if you want them to have admin access, and then you can give them different rights based on what you want them to have access to. Additionally, if we come into the settings for our users, we have even more further defined settings that we can set up. We have the option to set up that admins have to change their passwords every 180 days. However, we make a suggestion that you set it to maybe 60 to 90 days. That way, whenever a person's password expires, they have to create a new password for security purposes. Additionally, we have the option to create a password complexity option, where they have to have a minimum length of 8 characters, 1 uppercase, a lowercase, 1 numeric character, and 1 special character. And this enhances the security of our login users. Further down, we have more logon settings. We can set the maximum amount of simultaneous logins for the admin accounts. Enabling this option and setting it to 1 means that only one admin for the admin account. Let's just say that we have an admin account called admin, or you have a user account, we'll call it Bob, that is an admin. Those users can only log in once. You can't have multiple people sharing the same username and credentials to log into the device if you limit it to just 1. And additionally, at the bottom, we have a lockout option. This means that after a certain period of mistyped passwords or incorrect attempts, we can lock out the IP address for that user trying to log into the device. By default, it's set to 5, which is something that we recommend, and the lockout period is set to 30 minutes. So that means that if a user tries to gain access to the system by trying to log in and they enter a password incorrectly 5 times, their IP address will be logged and they'll be locked out of trying to log in for 30 minutes. Moving along, let's talk about remote access to the firewall. Now, by default, most people usually set up port 443 to log into their device. Sometimes they'll even go as far as to change port 443. And usually that's done by going over here to System, going to www, and changing the access port from 443 to say 8080 or 8081. However, we don't recommend doing this. The recommendation for this is to set it up so that you don't leave your external ports exposed. The only time you would ever leave your external ports exposed if you were doing something such as SSL VPN. And the reason for this is because you don't want to have any holes in your firewall. Any option for you to log in is another option for somebody else to gain access to your system. Now, you do have the ability to come in here to the admin service control, and you can set up a policy that only allows access from a specific IP address. Say if you're only accessing a business class firewall that's installed at someone else's location from your own home, you can put your own IP address in here to lock it down so that you only have access from that machine and that IP address. However, for best practices, we suggest that you do not leave your ports open. You might be asking, well, how do we gain access to the device? Well, in order to do that, we suggest that you come over to the VPN section and create an IPsec VPN. You can use our software. It's a license-based software for IPsec VPN, or you can use any other free third-party tools for IPsec VPN to get access to your system. Using this is a very secure way to gain access to the GUI because you'll be part of the localized network. That way, there are no holes on the outside of the firewall that allows other people to make attempts to get into the device. We do have options for also L2TP over IPsec, which is more widely available on iOS, Android, macOS, and Windows. However, compared to IPsec, it is not as secure as IPsec is. So you do have the choice. If you want to go with L2TP over IPsec, you can, but we suggest that you use basic IPsec VPN whenever possible. One of the things as well we have here is we have SSH that is enabled by default. However, it is not enabled on the outside. So it's only available if you're local to the network. Telnet is disabled by default. So you will have SSH access if you are local to the unit, if you need to do any localized SSH commands. And finally, what you also want to do is you want to check SNMP. Make sure that this is disabled unless you're using SNMP. If you're using SNMP, you can enable it and then enter all the information you need to get SNMP connected. However, it's suggested to make sure that if you're not using SNMP, disable this completely. Next, we're going to talk about the WAN and the LAN setup. So we come over here to network, we go to interface, then we come over to Ethernet, we can talk about our WAN and our LAN. So for your WAN, if you're doing any type of dual WAN setup, we have by default set up with an active-active connection if needed be. And also, I'm going to answer a question really quick because there was a question that came. I do apologize. Is there a way to release lockout using the GUI? There is only way that you can release it is either by rebooting it or using a CLI command to release it. Okay, so going back to the actual WAN port settings, we do support active-active and active-passive connections. So whenever you're doing any type of dual WAN, you're going to want to set up a connectivity check. So if we come into the WAN port, we can click on Edit, and then under Edit, we have to go Show Advanced to show the advanced settings. If we scroll further down, we can see that there's a connectivity check option. So what this connectivity check option does is it sends out a ping at an interval. And if the ping fails a specific amount of times, it'll consider that WAN port down and it will force the traffic to go off the secondary WAN port. So when you set up your connectivity check, always set up your connectivity check to never check the default gateway. Have it check an address out on the internet, be it 8.8.8.8 or 4.2.2.2, or even a host name or domain. The reason being is that your default gateway from your modem or from your ISP could still be alive and active. However, the hop that goes beyond the default gateway might be down. So make sure that you have it check addresses instead of the default gateway. You can set the fail tolerance. So it checks every 30 seconds by default. And then if it fails after 5 failures, which comes up after, it checks it as a ping. If it times out after 5 seconds, then it'll consider that a failure. That's 1 failure. It does it again, that's 2 failures, so on and so forth until it hits that fail tolerance. Once it hits the fail tolerance, then it will consider that WAN port down and it will automatically shift all traffic to the secondary WAN port. So this is something that you're going to want to do on both WAN 1 and WAN 2. Now, as far as your LAN is concerned, what you're going to want to do for your LAN is by default, the devices are usually set up with a specific subnet, 192.168.1.1. Because other devices, such as third-party routers that you can buy off the shelf at any brick and mortar store, they come with a very similar subnet address. So we suggest that you come in here and change your subnet address to be something other than 1.1. Furthermore, if you go to the Show Advanced Settings, you'll also have the ability to edit the DHCP server settings as well. So you can see that the start is .33, your pool size is 50, but make sure that you also edit this as well because this will be set to 1.33 by default. Finally, talking about configuration backup. Now, as you've gone through everything in the device and you've configured everything to get it all set up, you need to back up your configuration. So if we go to Maintenance and we go to File Manager, Configuration, we have multiple different configurations that are here by default. So the first one is going to be your system default.conf file. This is your default configuration. This is the configuration that is ran when you press the reset button on the front of the device. It puts it back to factory defaults. Second, here we have our last good configuration. This is automatically created every time you boot up the device and it goes through a good boot sequence. So that means that if you reset the unit and everything loads up perfectly fine and there's no issues, it takes a copy of your startup configuration and it writes it as the last good configuration file. And this is good as a way to its own backup system, so that if anything went wrong, you can always use that last good configuration. We have an auto backup. This auto backup configuration is created anytime that you create or actually upload a new firmware. So when a firmware is created and uploaded, it creates its own auto backup file of the current configuration. Then we have our startup-config file. This is going to be your running config. So anytime you make a change to the configuration, it is automatically applied to the startup config file. So if you go into your VLANs or you go and create a new policy route, it'll automatically update this file with the new changes. Now to back up your configuration, you have the option of doing a manual backup by taking this highlighted file, hitting the download button, and it'll download it directly to your desktop. Now for best practice's sake, we suggest that you take that configuration file, rename it to be the current date that you created the config, then re-upload it back up into this file manager by coming to the browse and browsing for that file and clicking upload. It'll put it directly into this file manager, which never gets erased. The great thing about this is that now you have a backup copy directly on the unit itself. So for instance, if something happens to where a admin user comes in and makes a change and you get locked out, what you can do then if you have that file already in here, you can do a hard reset of the firewall. It'll load the default config file with the default settings. You can log in with the default admin 1234 password. Then you can come back here to this file manager, pick up that file that you had already placed into the file manager that has the backup config, and then highlight it and click on apply, and it'll automatically put you back to where you were. Now, there also is another option that you can do. It's called schedule backup. Now, schedule backup allows you to automatically basically send an offline backup to an email of your choice. So if you do the enable auto backup, you could choose daily, weekly, monthly. You could choose the time and date. And what's great about this option is that it'll check to see, based on the current config, if there's any changes from the last config. So if there are any changes that were made since the last backup, it'll automatically send it. If you don't see any, if it doesn't see any changes, it will not send the configuration to the email. So a question comes up, so the hard reset doesn't wipe all the config files. Is there a way to wipe everything, such as when the unit is EOL or being sewn or thrown out? There is a CLI command to actually wipe the configs that actually deletes everything in there as well. So if you don't want to run it through the CLI, you can come into the configuration and then just delete everything except for your last good, your system default, and your startup config file. So if you want to, resell the unit, or if the device becomes EOL, you can just delete them manually or through the CLI. And that's basics for setting up best practices for the firewall itself. So again, we covered the signature updates, the firmware updates, the user accounts, the remote management, WAN and LAN, and the configuration backup. So at this point, I'll just leave it open for any questions that anybody has, and we'll leave this open for a little bit of time here. The question is, what's the CLI command to completely wipe everything? If you want, I can actually, if you email me at marcush@zyxel.com, shoot me an email, and then I can actually provide that command to you. One of the questions that came up was, what is the best way to set up dual WAN failover? That is a very good question. If you come over to the configuration panel here, we have something called the trunk port. And this is where you configure your failover. So the system default WAN trunk, if we go here and edit this here, you'll see by default, everything is set to active. And then the load balancing algorithm is going to be least load first. So by default, both WANs are active. They're going to pass traffic on both WAN 1 and WAN 2, but the default algorithm is going to be least load first. So least load first, basically, as it sounds, means that whatever WAN port is under the least amount of load is going to be where the traffic is going to be sent. We do have other options, such as weighted round robin, which uses a weighted system where you can define, say, WAN port 1 has a weight of 5 and WAN port 2 has a weight of 1. And that means that for every 5, it's like a 5-to-1 ratio in terms of throughput. So for every 5 megs, you send 1 meg down the other pipe. And then finally, we have spillover, which uses the first WAN port as the main WAN port. And then when it fills up and it exceeds the throughput or the bandwidth that is available on that line, it then dumps the rest of the throughput over to the secondary WAN port. So you have the option to choose your load balancing algorithms. And then if you want, you can create your own specific user configuration trunk by coming here to add. You can choose which members will be part of that particular WAN. So for here, we can say, the SFP port and say our WAN port. And then the SFP will be your main WAN 1. Your WAN will be WAN 2. And what you can do here is you can do active passive. So active passive means that the first WAN port is going to be, say, your cable connection. And then your WAN 2 is going to be your DSL, which is the slower connection. So in active passive, all traffic will go out the first WAN port first. And then should the WAN port 1 go down, it'll go over to WAN port 2 automatically. Question, how does the last known config work again? So basically, anytime the device is rebooted, it goes through the whole setup process. It basically reloads your startup config file. And if it goes to the whole startup configuration file without any errors, it automatically makes a copy of that startup config file as the last good config. So you'll only see that that configuration update every time you reboot the device and it goes through a good boot. There's a question on the Ethernet interface with the PPP connection. What's the recommended way to configure the connectivity check on the Ethernet interface or on the PP interface or both? Well, if you're doing the PPPoE connection, what you can do for PPPoE or for PPP is going to be, this is going to be your information for the account to get it connected, but you're going to still want to do it on your Ethernet port itself, because the Ethernet port is going to be connected to the modem. So at that point, what you can do is set up your WAN connectivity check on the WAN itself. Okay, I have another question that came in. I had a configuration file running from January 2020. It was set up by my tech who is now unavailable. I had saved the config file and implemented it successfully, but after updating from 4.6 to 4.62, the additions and changes made to the config file are no longer working. I wonder if I might have a difference in the later firmware updates that may have precluded that particular config file. It's quite possible, because whenever you go from one firmware to another, there is some changes that are made to the config file. And that's what we see here with this auto backup. What it does is it copies your current startup configuration file and then applies the information from that particular firmware. If there's any new menus or any new options, and it places them in that configuration file and then creates an automatic backup. If you have this option here available, if you do see this config, you might want to try running an auto backup file that you may have. If not, what you can do is possibly call our tech support, and then they can probably look at the actual configuration file itself and maybe like do a compare analysis between the old configuration file and the newer one to see what differences were or what changes have been made to see why some things maybe didn't carry over. Let's see, there's a new question that came in. Except for occasional Zyxel support, we only access our ATP internally. So it would be recommended that we should disable service control HTTPS to remove the server port. Yes, we suggest that you do that because you don't want to leave it open. Specifically, if you're doing any type of PCI scans, that will show up as a possible fail. I know that it hasn't been 100% ratified right now, and I know that different scans from different companies may show that you may pass or fail. But you're going to want to leave that port closed unless you're doing any type of web hosting internally. Like if you're forwarding 443 to an internal web server, then you would, of course, leave it open. But we suggest that you close that off if possible. You can use IPsec VPN. If you don't want to use IPsec VPN, you can use, say, remote desktop, or not RDP, but basically like LogMeIn or any of those remote desktop or remote access software that allows you access to a computer behind the device. But definitely not RDP because you're forwarding 3389 to a machine on the inside, and you don't want to give access to a machine to the outside world. So any of those other LogMeIn type services, you can use that, or we highly suggest using a VPN because that's the most secure option. Any chance you can go over SecuReporter, configuring it to report back? That's something that's going to be available when I do the best practices for setting up your security services. So I'll actually be going over that when I do that webinar. There's a question, what is SecuManager? That is our cloud management software that is soon going to be replaced by the Nebula version of the USG Flex. It was something that we were offering on a trial basis to specific clients that needed it. Basically what it was is if you've been with us for quite a long time, we had something in the past called Vantage Reports, which was a software that was ran on a virtual server that allowed you to log into it and manage multiple devices from this particular virtual machine. SecuManager is basically an upgrade of that. However, we are now moving away from it, mainly because of the fact that the USG Flex is going to be available in Nebula Orchestrator in the next coming weeks. But basically, it was just a management software to allow you to manage multiple firewalls and perform configuration updates, push VPN configs, and do a lot of maintenance, basically from a virtual machine. Another question came in, is there any concept of config templates or something equivalent if we're selling many of these and want to have standardized file settings? No, we don't have a configuration template. However, we do have something available. You can set up scripting. In fact, we're on that screen right now. If we go over to shell script, you can use our CLI reference guide and build out what we call a .zysh file, which is a script that runs all the CLI commands. So you can actually set up a script in a file that has all the configuration commands that basically sets up the unit in a standardized way. And then you can take that shell script and upload it here in this section on the firewall. And then when you run it, it'll basically pre-configure everything. Now, if you are using our USG Flex series, when it gets put in the cloud, things are going to be a little bit more different because if you are familiar with our Nebula cloud devices, you'll have the ability to actually pre-configure everything in the cloud with the Nebula or with the USG Flex, so that, for instance, if you want to send a device to a customer, as it's in transit, you'll be able to go into the Nebula Orchestrator and pre-configure that device so that once they get it, they can just plug it in, it'll dial home and pull the configuration down. Another option says, can we use the copy option in the firmware management section to back up a firmware file to keep it on the device? So in the firmware management section, we have here, we don't have a copy option, but what you can do is, since there's two firmwares, it's always going to download the latest firmware to the standby, and you'll have a copy of the current running firmware. So for instance, if the current firmware version is 4.62, if I downloaded that to this device, it will then place that firmware into the standby, run it, and then that becomes the running firmware, and then the backup standby now becomes 4.6. So that means that if anything goes wrong, let's just say that maybe the firmware didn't apply properly, you can always roll back to the previous firmware. That's the purpose of having two firmware banks. There's a question about what about SSL VPN? We need 443 open. Is that best practice? Should we switch to IPsec? To be honest, I mean, 443, yes, you do need it open for SSL VPN. However, IPsec is more secure than SSL VPN is. So that's why we kind of make the suggestion to push people to use IPsec. You can use SSL VPN. I know that it's a lot easier to use and it's pretty easy to adopt, specifically when you have clients that just want something simple to just open up a web browser, point to a domain, enter your username and password, and have access to the VPN. But I mean, you're leaving 443 open. You can kind of decide if you want to, but we suggest that if possible, if you're not, if you want to switch from SSL VPN to IPsec and have a more secure connection and have a much faster connection, because SSL is much slower than IPsec. You can look into switching over to IPsec. We recommend it if as best as possible. However, it's going to be based on the client and their requirements. If there is a cost associated if you use our IPsec client VPN because it is licensed out. However, there are third-party options that are free that you can use and we do support. So that's just something that you'll have to kind of decide with the client if that's what they want to do. There's a question about how does it change when the USG goes to Nebula. The USG Flex is very similar to our Flex devices, like our Flex APs and our Flex switches. So you have the option of running it in standalone, which is what you're normally used to, which is your standardized local management. When it goes into Nebula, the settings are going to be pretty much the same. You'll have to reconfigure everything in Nebula. So when you go from the standalone to Nebula, there may be some configuration changes. They haven't given us the full spec rollout yet, but we do know that you can choose between localized managed and cloud managed. And when you're in cloud managed, you're going to have the same kind of configuration stack as you do locally. But then when it's in Nebula, all you have to do is go to our Nebula website and log in with your My Zyxel credentials. And at that point, you'll be able to remotely control everything on the Flex USG from the cloud. Another question came in, how do you set up Security Reporter so it shows data? Again, that's going to be something that I go over in complete detail when I do the best practices for setting up your security services webinar, which will be happening sometime in the future. I'll go over how to set up all of your services, from the content filtering, the best practices for setting that up, for setting up your malware, your antivirus, your sandboxing, all that good stuff. And in addition to that, how to set up Security Reporter so that it reports data. And if you don't know, our Security Reporter is basically our cloud-based syslog server that basically grabs all of our security information and provides it into a nice reporting software so that you can provide to your customers. You can give your customers a report on a daily or weekly basis that shows what your users are doing and what they're consuming. For instance, let's just say that you set up your application patrol to log everything. You can then provide that to the customer in a report that shows them, well, your customers are using, or your users are using 30% of the bandwidth using Facebook, or most of their time is spent browsing Reddit or YouTube. You can provide that in the report. So that's what Security Reporter does. When is the ATP going to Nebula? We don't have a date on that yet. Our product manager, Tri, might have a little bit more information on that, but as of right now, there's still some discussion about getting the ATP into Nebula. But right now, the USG Flex is going to be the first device that goes into Nebula. Is there any official information available to us which definition vendor is used for ATP definitions? Yes. Okay. So for our AV, we actually use two different subscription models. We have a local database and we have a cloud database. So we use McAfee for one of our databases. And then for the other database, the name escapes me, Give me just a second here. Bitdefender. Yes, we use Bitdefender and we use McAfee for our signatures. So we have a local signature database that it scans against, and then you can also do a cloud database to scan against as well. So Bitdefender is going to be local, and then McAfee is going to be our cloud-based signature. You could choose to scan locally or externally or both at the same time. Another question, one more question. Have customer with the ATP 100 not quite ready to update his security pack subscription? What is he missing out on that is over and high and above in over high in router? Okay, with the ATP, the main thing is going to be the sandboxing. The sandboxing is probably the biggest feature on the ATP. And the way that that works specifically is going to be that it checks the local and cloud database. If you have it set up in hybrid mode, just check local and remote for your malware. It'll check both of those. And if it doesn't find a signature that matches the pattern for the file, let's just say that somebody downloaded something and it looks suspicious, it'll check the local database first. It'll check the external database if you have it set up. And if it can't find a signature, what it'll then do is say, okay, well, that file that's coming in, I don't understand what it is. First, let's go ahead and block that file. Let's delete it. But then let's take a copy of it and send it into the cloud to be ran in sandboxing so it can be analyzed. So that file gets sent to our sandboxing server. It's running multiple iterations to find out exactly what it does and determine if that file is a threat or not. If that file is a threat, it's going to make a signature and it's going to send it back to the firewall and also share with other firewalls as well. So you get pretty much protection from zero-day threats by using the sandboxing feature on the ATP. Do you recommend a free or open source IPsec client that works well with a Zyxel device? There are a few out there. I know that there's Mac-based ones. I know there's TrueVPN, and that's the one I can think of off the top of my head. But we do have our own. Again, it is licensed out, but we do have customers who are using other third-party vendors that work perfectly well with us. So you do have the option of choosing either ours or you can choose our competitors. But something to think about here is I'm going to show you something that we do offer with our VPN client. So on our VPN client under IPsec VPN, we do have configuration provisioning. So with configuration provisioning, you don't have to worry about the client having to know all of the pre-shared keys, knowing all of the IKE requirements. With configuration provisioning and our software, our IPsec software, all the customer has to do is put in a username and password for their VPN, and it'll connect with our firewall and automatically download the configuration file directly to their software and automatically configure it for them so that they don't have to worry about entering that information in. Additionally, our software VPN client does have the ability to set up something called auto RDP, so that when it connects to the firewall, if you have RDP set up on your network, if you have machines that respond to RDP or you have clients that need access into their own devices, it'll automatically connect up to that, that local machine and give them the login prompt for that machine to log in. So we do have that auto RDP instant on connection option in our software. Will there be anything coming up that covers high availability? Yes, that's something that's going to be planned later on. We do get a lot of questions about how to set up the high availability on our devices, as there's a little bit of confusion on what's the best topology to set that up. But yeah, there will be a webinar in the future on how to set that up. All right. How does the USG Flex compare with the ATP series? Hardware-wise, they're very similar. With the Flex series, though, it's going to have that ability to be managed in the cloud right now. The ATP eventually, we hope, will be in the cloud at some point in time, but the USG Flex is going to be the first one to go into the cloud. So you're going to have the ability to have the flexibility of going standalone and into the cloud. One of the things that the Flex does have missing, though, is going to be the sandboxing. So the Flex does have everything that the ATP does, minus the sandboxing aspect. So that's going to be what their main differences are going to be. Gateway to gateway VPN. Yes, we do actually support that. So in the IPsec section here, you can do a gateway to gateway VPN. You can set up a VPN IPsec IKEv2 from our device to, say, a Fortinet or a Juniper. It doesn't matter. We work with all third-party gateways. You can connect from our device to another device. We can also go ATP to ATP, ATP to USG. It doesn't matter. So you can go gateway to gateway. A question comes in: can I name some IPsec clients? There's Shrew VPN. I think there's a Forta client. Those are specific ones off the top of my head. If you can email me directly at marcush@zyxel.com about the VPN clients, I can give you a list specifically for IPsec clients. Can you name clients connect via SSL VPN and IPsec at the same time? No. So our SSL VPN uses something that we call Secu Extender, which is a specialized piece of software that downloads to the Windows machine or Mac OS. So it's our own proprietary kind of software that uses the SSL VPN to make the connection. So you can't use any third-party SSL VPNs to work with ours. You have to use our specific software. I believe the Mac version does have a license, but the Windows version is free. What are the differences between the Flex and the ATP? Again, the Flex is going to be the same hardware as the ATP. They're going to be very similar. The main difference being that the ATP does have sandboxing, and the Flex does not. And the Flex will be able to be used in Nebula, which is our cloud-based software for remote management. So you can choose to be either standalone or you can choose to be managed in the cloud. Isn't webroot used as well? Yes. The signatures that I was talking about were specifically in regards to the malware and basically the malware detection on the device. Do you have a best practice instruction for security services? That will be an upcoming webinar. So I will go through how to set up all of the security services and the best practices for setting up your content filtering, your antivirus, your sandboxing, pretty much all of that. Does configuration provisioning require 443 to be open? And can you send a document on how to set that up? I'll tell you what, if you email me at marcush@zyxel.com, I can send out a document on how to set that up. It's using our specific VPN client. So our IPsec VPN client does have the auto provisioning, and then it also has the auto RDP, so that when you connect up, it automatically connects to your RDP services. Can templates in Nebula be stacked? By stacked, you mean setting up multiple templates and then sending them out to multiple customers? Can you elaborate on the question, and I'll come back to it? Will the default Windows 10 IPsec client work with the IPsec VPN? No, currently it does not. However, we do have one of the things that we do get asked about specifically is going to be the built-in IPsec on iOS and Android. We do have the ability to set up a IKEv2 VPN using IPsec with those devices with iOS and Android, but Android uses Swan Strong VPN, and I think with iOS we have an actual certificate that is downloaded to the iOS device to get it to connect up. Anything on NAT, virtual server, port forwarding, and policy control? I can touch on that really quick, but that's going to be something that's kind of covered in a later topic. But basically, we do have the ability to set up your port forwarding in our NAT section. We do have the different types. So we have virtual server, one-to-one, and many-to-one. Your virtual server is going to be your basic port forwarding, and then your one-to-one NAT is when you want to hit the specific outside IP address. Maybe you have a block of IPs given to you from your ISP. You can use any IP address on the block, and then you can have it forwarded or bound to a specific internal IP address, which is great for maybe a web server. But we do have the option to set that up. We have virtual server, of course, is our port forwarding. And then in addition to setting up your port forwarding, you have to go directly into the security policy, which is our firewall, to basically allow the traffic to come into the LAN just by default, because if you don't, it'll hit the firewall, but then it'll get forwarded. And then if you don't set the right packet direction with the proper ports being open, the traffic will basically just get denied and it'll get lost and it won't go to its destination. But yeah, that's something that we'll probably, I'll cover at a later date in a different topic, specifically to kind of go over that, because, these firewalls, there's a lot of different configuration options, and it's very hard to hit on all of them at the same time. So it's going to have to be kind of like a focused webinar specifically to cover that. Okay, so I'll leave the floor open for a little bit longer to see if there's any more questions that need to be asked. Okay, so the example came in for the template on Nebula. Basically, template A has a security service configuration, and template B has a LAN setup. Can they be applied and change what is in their scope without affecting any of the other settings? There is an update coming to Nebula in the future that's going to expand on config. Basically, when you do like a site clone or a config clone from the Nebula gateways. So there should be expanded options on how to set that up. So I'll look into that and see if that's going to be something in the roadmap. But as of right now, it doesn't have that option to where you can kind of modify the current config so that you can apply specific aspects of the template to certain devices. So I'll look into see if that's something on the roadmap, and you can email me directly just so I don't forget, so I can email you back the information once I get it. One of the options that, or one of the questions that came in was, it would be great to go over all the ATP functions at the same time. Again, that would be a very long webinar, especially because I've done one-on-ones with a lot of customers with doing that screen share and kind of going over the ATP security settings alone, and that takes at least an hour to go over all of that. So it's going to have to be something that's going to be broken up to go over all of the functions. But right now, the security setup is going to be probably the next webinar I do, only because of the fact that it's often requested a lot by a lot of our partners. But I could put something together that we can do a multi-part series to kind of go over all the ATP functions. But right now, the focus is going to be the security policy setup. Oh, and then one more thing. When it comes to, it was a question about setting up templates. I was reminded, actually, one of the things you can do is you can create a base config file that, if you want to do it that way, you can come over to our configuration here and take your startup configuration file. You can create kind of like a base config with maybe just like the IP address, all of your policies that you want to set up. And then if you need to apply that to another device, you can just go into the configuration file and edit maybe the WAN IP address of the config file, and then you can apply it to any other device. So that can be your start base config file. Just be aware that these configuration files are not transferable between different models. So if you have an ATP 100 config file, it's only good for the ATP 100. So if you want to do it on the ATP 200, you have to make a base configuration file for that one, because they aren't transferable between model numbers. Okay, I guess if there's not going to be any more questions, we're going to go ahead and close off this webinar. Look forward to the next webinar that I do. We're going to be going over, again, best practices for setting up your security services. Again, that's going to be your antivirus, your content filtering, your anti-spam, all of that good stuff, and the best practices of setting that up, along with touching on how to set up SecuReporter to report that information as well. So again, I look forward to hosting another webinar, and I hope that you guys join. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.